Ethan Reed walked the darkened streets of Chicago, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his leather jacket. The city's late autumn chill seeped into his bones, but he welcomed the cold. It sharpened his focus, made him feel alive. Tonight was no different from any other night. Another evening spent blending into the shadows, watching. The mark was Emily Davenport, a successful graphic designer who lived alone in an upscale apartment complex. Ethan had been watching her for weeks, studying her routines with meticulous care. He knew when she left for work, what time she returned, the coffee shop she frequented, and the route she took during her evening jogs. To her, he was invisible, just another nameless face in the city's sea of strangers. But to Ethan, she was everything. Emily's lighthearted laughter echoed in his mind as he recalled the way she had joked with the barista this morning. It had taken all his willpower not to step forward, not to make himself known. But Ethan had learned patience. He knew that time was his ally. Emily felt the weight of someone watching her again as she exited her apartment building. It wasn't the first time she'd had this feeling. For weeks now, a nagging sense of unease had clung to her. She had brushed it off at first, dismissing it as paranoia, but the feeling had grown stronger. A sense of eyes boring into her when she walked down the street or sat by her window. She had even started changing her routine, taking different routes to work and varying her jogging schedule. But the feeling lingered. She adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced around the quiet street. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. "Get it together, Emily," she muttered under her breath as she headed toward her car. Unbeknownst to her, Ethan stood in the shadow of a nearby building, watching her every move. He knew she had become more cautious lately, and he found it thrilling. The way she looked over her shoulder, the way her pace quickened in the dark. It was intoxicating. The next morning, Emily awoke to a strange sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to pull her from sleep. She sat up, her heart pounding, and strained to listen. There it was again. A soft scrape, like something brushing against her balcony door. She grabbed her phone and tiptoed toward the living room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The curtains were drawn, and she hesitated for a moment before pulling them back. The balcony was empty, but her potted plants had been disturbed, their leaves scattered across the floor. Just the wind, she told herself, though her voice trembled. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. After double-checking the locks, she returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Outside, Ethan watched from the shadows of a nearby alley. He had been so careful not to leave any evidence, but the thrill of being so close to her had nearly undone him. He had wanted to see her reaction, to see the fear in her eyes. And he had. The memory of her hesitant movements, the way she had drawn the curtains, played over and over in his mind like a symphony. Emily decided to install a security camera the next day. She didn't want to admit it, but she was scared. The idea of being watched, of someone invading her space, was suffocating. She talked to her best friend Clara about it over lunch, and Clara had insisted she take precautions. "You're not being paranoid," Clara had said. "This city's full of creeps. Better safe than sorry." The security camera was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the unease. That evening, as she sat on the couch with a glass of wine and her favorite movie, she found herself glancing at the camera feed on her phone. The live video showed her empty balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Ethan watched her through the window, his breath fogging up the glass. He knew about the camera. He'd seen the installer leave earlier in the day. It didn't matter. He had no intention of being caught on film. His obsession with Emily had grown to the point where he couldn't stay away. She was his. She just didn't know it yet. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's presence in Emily's life grew darker. He began leaving subtle signs for her to find. A single red rose on her doorstep, an anonymous note tucked under her windshield wiper. The notes were never threatening, just cryptic messages that he knew would haunt her. "You're even more beautiful when you're scared. I'm closer than you think. Emily's fear turned to desperation. She reported the incidents to the police, but without any concrete evidence or witnesses, there was little they could do. She started staying with Clara more often, but she couldn't avoid going home forever. Her apartment was her sanctuary, and Ethan had stolen that from her. One night as she lay awake in Clara's guest room, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the security camera app. Her heart dropped as she opened the feed. The balcony door was open. Emily stared at the screen, her mind racing. She hadn't left the door open. The wind couldn't have done it. She'd locked it before leaving. And then she saw it, a shadow moving across the living room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She called the police, her hands shaking as she explained the situation. By the time they arrived, the apartment was empty. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of the intruder. But the rose lying on her pillow said it all. Ethan was careful after that. He knew he'd pushed her too far, and the increased police presence around her building made him cautious. But his obsession was too powerful to resist. He watched from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. That moment came on a rainy Friday night. Emily had returned to her apartment, exhausted after a long week. The rain hammered against the windows as she curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book. She had convinced herself that the worst was over, that the stalker had moved on. She was wrong. Ethan had waited for the storm, knowing it would cover any noise he made. He'd disabled her security camera earlier that day, using a jammer he'd bought online. Now, as she read her book, he stood in the hallway outside her door, the key he'd stolen from her bag clutched in his hand. He turned the key slowly, the lock clicking open. The sound was swallowed by the storm. Ethan stepped inside, his heart pounding with anticipation. He could see her, sitting on the couch, completely unaware of his presence. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. But as he took a step forward, the floor creaked beneath his weight. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror as she saw him standing there, dripping wet and holding a knife. She screamed, scrambling off the couch and grabbing the first thing she could find, a heavy glass vase. She hurled it at him, and it shattered against his shoulder, causing him to stumble. But he recovered quickly, lunging toward her. Emily ran, her bare feet slipping on the wet floor. As she made her way toward the bedroom, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan pounded on the door, his voice calm but menacing. "You can't hide from me, Emily. You're mine." She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the line was dead. He'd cut the power earlier. Panic set in as she looked around the room for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. Ethan kicked the door open, the frame splintering under the force. Emily screamed as he stepped inside, his knife gleaming in the dim light. But she didn't back down. She grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it at him, catching him in the side of the head. He staggered, blood dripping from a gash on his temple. Emily didn't hesitate. She pushed past him and ran for the front door. Ethan recovered quickly, chasing her down the hallway. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but she fought with everything she had, kicking and scratching. Suddenly, the door burst open, and 2 police officers stormed in, guns drawn. Clara had called them after Emily hadn't answered her phone. They ordered Ethan to drop the knife, but he refused, his eyes wild with rage. One of the officers fired, the bullet hitting Ethan in the shoulder. He dropped the knife and collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around him. Emily sank to her knees, sobbing as the officers cuffed him and dragged him away. In the weeks that followed, Emily tried to rebuild her life. Ethan was behind bars awaiting trial, but the scars he had left on her were deep. She'd lost her sense of safety, her ability to trust, but she was determined to take back her life, one step at a time. And as she sat on her balcony one evening, watching the sunset, she reminded herself that she had survived. Ethan Reed had tried to break her, but she was stronger than he ever could have imagined.